So before before I begin, I would like to make a couple of housekeeping notes. The first one is that this is a fairly um, anachronistic or polychronistic talk. It will be in chronological order, more or less, but imagine you're in a fairly temperamental time machine. There will be some back and forth. Secondly, there will be images of human remains and anatomical models. Just as a fair warning, nothing terribly gruesome, but just wanted to warn you. So, as Dr. Boran explained, the very early promoters of the medical school at Trinity College were John Stern and Sir Patrick Dunn. And I'm not going to repeat her contributions on that, but just say that the primary mover was Sir Patrick Dunn, as he was a prominent physician and president of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. He spearheaded a campaign to to cement the anatomical teaching in Trinity and submitted a bequest of his income for the purpose of building what was to be called the Anatomy House in Trinity as a center of anatomical education in the college. And you can see the Trinity Anatomy House over here. It's this little building on the right. And here it is on the isometric map of the college. Now, we have very, very little information about what was in the anatomical house. We do know there was a lecture theater, a dissection hall, and a museum. We have exceedingly little information about what was in the museum. However, we do know that it was an 18th century style museum that combined anatomy and natural history. So it is purported to contain pathological and anatomical specimens as well as animal remains such as orca skeleton. This is one of the oldest references to the museum. We believe that this was actually penned by Jonathan Swift. It's an episode to Gorgeous Edmund Howard, who you see at the bottom image, and with notes. Alderman George Faulkner, supposedly, probably Jonathan Swift, writes that their charms shall last in song divine, like embryos preserved in wine. And then that line is explained in the notes, the satirical notes, where, sorry, I can't really see that. So it explains some of the items that you would see in the Anatomical Museum at the time. This is the 1700s, and it includes human figures of both sexes in wax, a dead shark, that is the orca I mentioned, an Egyptian mummy, which we indeed still have, as well as other specimens that I will be showing you. Now, the waxes are quite important in the story, as they were some of the oldest collection items that we have, and we have very little remains of them. We know that they were in very heavy use. They were anatomical Venuses made by Denouet, who initially worked with Gaetano Zumbo, whose collection is in La Specola in Florence, creating anatomical models from wax modeled on actual human skeletons. and this is one of Zumbo's models. Denue was a surgeon that was really successful in preserving human remains using injections of wax. However, Denue and Zumbo had a falling out, and Denue started collaborating with another artist, Francois Lacroix. And I believe that the remains of the collection we have were made by him, as they are significantly less detailed and cruder than Zumbo's. I'm sorry, that's my cat. Oh my God. All right. Moving on. So these are some of the remains that we have. They're very fragmentary, broken, and damaged. I'm trying to conserve them or stabilize them as best as I can, and once we have the ability to, we will be engaging a wax conservator. October. Sorry. Some more of those waxes. We have the surface of brain anatomy on the right, and the male bladder on the left. And you can see they're quite detailed, but they're not as sophisticated as Zumbo's models. One of the people that took care of those models in the first place was Georgius Gleckhorn. He was a popular and one of the first anatomists in the anatomy house. And I believe the item on the right is one of his specimens. Unfortunately, Georgius Gleckhorn wanted his children to succeed him in anatomical teaching. He did not have any children, however, so that honor went to his nephew James, who had very little interest in anatomy and ended up resigning in 1802 from the medical school and taking his uncle's collection with him. Now, what do we have from the 1711 Anatomy Museum other than the waxes? We have the skeleton that you see in the middle, that is Cornelius Mcgrath. He's kind of hard to miss. And the skeleton you see at the far right, that is William Clark. And I will explain why they're collected. So Cornelius Mcgrath was what was called an Irish giant. And you may be familiar with the Irish giant Byrne in the Hunterian, but Cornelius Mcgrath is our very own Irish giant in Ireland. He was born in 1737 and died in 1760, and he was of no remarkable characteristic, as was described at the time, till the age of 15, at which point he grew at an extraordinary rate. And he is portrayed here in the style of giants at the time. There were several giants around Europe that exhibited themselves and toured Europe, and one of the postures was to extend one arm and have a typical sized person stand underneath them, just to show their comparative height. And here he is painted. This portrait is in Venice. His skeleton remained in the museum, as I said. However, it underwent a lot of damage. As Dr. Cunningham writes, one of the later curators of the museum, as he writes in the turn of the 19th century, his skeleton had been varnished so badly that he was unrecognizable. And you can see some of the remnants of that varnish around the his pelvis, the darker areas. Um, he was also fragmented. So Dr. Cunningham underwent great efforts to have uh, exquisitely detailed and accurate representations of the missing fragments in wood. You might be able to see that in his hands. Um, there are also pieces on his pelvis and his wrist. Why do we keep a specimen like Cornelius Mcgrath? Cornelius has been the subject of research. He has his skeleton has greatly assisted in determining the different types of acromegaly, that is the condition that he suffered from, and that in his case was caused by a pituitary tumor, or a tumor on the pituitary gland that provoked this excessive growth. And here he is pictured with Brendan Holland, who's alive today and also suffering from the same condition. And, oops, sorry. So our specimens are part of ongoing research, and we keep uncovering new stories through them. And one of the other quite important and original specimens from the 1711 museum is William Clark. William Clark is one of the two skeletons we have that has a very rare condition called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. That means literally fiber displacement by osteophytes. Those are the cells that turn into bone, to put it simply. And this condition is autoimmune, it's inflammatory, and it's triggered by trauma. So instead of a muscle repairing itself after trauma with muscle fibers, it would be done with osteophytes, bone cells. So gradually, the sufferer develops a second skeleton. And you can see that in the other specimen we have that is from a later time. She is unidentified. She's from 1843 and was kept in Dr. Stevens Hospital. Now, these two specimens were instrumental in diagnosing conditions of patients in the 19th century. And they were also instrumental in the 18th century for the same reason. So this is a very, very rare condition. It affects about 700 people today. The skeletons we have are 2 of 6 in the world that I know of. And the 2 skeletons were helpful in helping Dr. Edward Bennett in the 19th century to diagnose and treat 11-year-old girl who had the same condition. It presents as tumor-like growths, and what usually happens when it's undiagnosed is that surgery is employed to remove those growths, which results in more trauma, which results in more growths. So it's essential to diagnose it. And the skeletons in museums around the world have also been involved in research. This is this is a paper written in University of Pennsylvania by Dr. Kaplan and Eileen Shore on the Mutter Museum specimen. And here's another view, and we ourselves have also engaged in DNA research involving the 2 specimens. Now I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about how the museum that we currently have came to be. And it's all the work of James Mccartney. He was a very popular anatomist of his time, extremely popular with students. And he was passionate in promoting the anatomy house and the anatomical teaching at Trinity. However, he was aware that the anatomy house of 1711 was literally falling apart. So he went into great lengths to convince the college to invest in creating new buildings for anatomy. And the plan you see on the right are his own sketches of what he wanted that to look like. It was very grand, as you can see at the very top. And unfortunately, this is what he had to compromise for. The middle building is where the museum still is. These buildings were later encased by newer structures, which I will show you. Professor Mccartney was embroiled in a few scandals with grave robbing, as Dr. Boran mentioned. They are the anatomy practice and teaching in the 19th century and before that are inextricably linked with grave robbing, because the dissection was the demand for bodies for dissection greatly exceeded the availability of them. So recognizing this, Dr. Mccartney went out of his way to collect signatures of fellow physicians and friends that were willing to donate their own bodies to promote the donation of cadavers for dissection and supply the medical schools with more bodies in a less sorted fashion. And he managed to get 316 signatories. We're still trying to cross-reference these names, but we have this scroll that you see on the left, digitized and transcribed. One of the individuals who ended up donating her body was Madame de Rubigny-Barret. She was, according to Mccartney, an incredible person that was part of the Amazons of Paris, which were female equestrians that had performances in armor. And she donated her body to the medical school for the express purpose of dissection and the promotion of anatomical science. And she was the first woman to do so. And this is in 1832. Sorry, this is out of order. My apologies. These are the two fibrodysplasia ossificans skeletons in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which have also been donated by their original owners of the skeletons. And they have been involved in research as well. Now, later on, as I said, the anatomy buildings, the old ones, some of them are torn down except for the museum, the Mccartney Museum, and are encased in larger buildings. The building on the left is the building that the museum is housed in now, and still stands, and the pathology building on the right also still stands but houses a different department. And you can see another view of the School of Anatomy on the left, and on the right is a 1933 view of the museum, the Old Anatomy Museum. And you can see Cornelius Mcgrath at the very end, near the window. And this is a view from 1887 And as you can see, it remains unchanged through the 30s. The museum is adjacent to a lecture theater. The lecture theater is built on the model of 19th century lecture theater that was then refurbished by Professor Erskine in the 1950s. So it has that kind of aesthetic and murals on the walls that he himself painted that portray an anatomical dissection. Now, the Mccartney's original plans were not really carried out as you can imagine, but the facilities that he wanted to have in the medical school were there. So there was a lecture theater, uh, a dissection hall, laboratories, and laboratories for sorry, photography. The other items in our collection are largely anatomical. We have a large collection of anatomical plasters and wax models, and uh, the majority of the plaster models are made by Stuart in Germany, and fairly old continuing model manufacturer. And you can see a few more here. And we also have anatomical preparations by Tramont of Paris. And these were exquisite dissections purposefully made for the clear demonstration of anatomy and its structures. Now, as you can imagine, the educators of the time did not have the kind of technology that we do, so they really relied on models, preparations, and wet specimens, as well as illustrations. These are portraits of patients with Graves' disease on the left, and the woman on the right has now extinct, so to speak, or rarely encountered condition called hyperchromidosis, where she had excess melanin in areas of her face that we think might have been related to exposure to toxic metals, perhaps at her profession. A lot of the illustrations that were made were by James Connolly, and they were later engraved and shared in anatomical journals, like this woman with a 14-pound tumor, benign tumor, that shortly after her portrait was taken here, she finally decided to have it removed. The undertaking of surgery like that was an extremely difficult and risky procedure for anyone to undergo at the time. This is before sepsis, before antiseptic measures and germ theory. So you can imagine how anxious she would have been to make that decision. Like I mentioned, we have some wet specimens, and we also have some pathological specimens from the original pathology museum that was in the building that I showed you before. We do not know the whereabouts of the whole of the collection, so we're still trying to piece together the puzzle of what went where and what do we have from the original collection. Some of the wet specimens in the collection are absolutely remarkable, if I may say so myself. These were prepared by Dr. Cunningham, who I mentioned earlier, and they were modeled after medical illustration. So he used plaster to encase his dissections in the same way that the paper of illustrations um, is functions as a background. And you can see just how minute and detailed that is. These are the facial nerves and the parotid gland. And this is Dr. Cunningham. He wrote the Manual of Practical Anatomy and the Textbook of Anatomy. And there's also a dissection manual modeled after his writings. He was a multi-talented man. He created plaster models from some of his dissections, studying the cerebral morphology. And these plaster models can now be found in different parts of the world, or copies of the plaster models, including Australia. And you can see them on the right. This is one of those plaster models, modeled after James Conway, a centenarian. Cunningham was very interested in old I should say very interested in aging and how that affected the brain. And he was engaged in finding people who were not as affected by aging in terms of their faculties. And James Conway reportedly died at 107, but he had his faculties intact and his memory intact till about 3 weeks before he passed. Cunningham was also extremely interested in anatomical variations. On the right, you see a sternalis muscle, and that is the muscle going vertically, and that is an extra or extraneous muscle that is on top of the pectoral. And again, cerebral topography. He made the dissections on the left, and then was engaged in getting them photographed and presented in a stereoscopic format. So the brain on the bottom right was photographed by two slightly different angles, and it was meant to be viewed with a stereoscope, which is kind of like a viewfinder, or the 3D glasses that you would use in a 3D movie, and it created a sort of three-dimensional effect. So he was very interested in using the latest technologies to instruct his students. Like I said, he's interested in anatomical variations, and he studies some of the older specimens in the collection, including this set of three-lobed lungs. Lungs typically have 3 lobes on the right and 2 on the left. This one has a 3rd lobe on the left as well. And he wanted to examine these specimens, such as this one, in terms of Darwin's theories. Now, the collection in numbers. We have an incredible array of specimens and models, a lot of which is in boxes and a lot of which is not cataloged. So our task at the current time is to go through the collection and research it and catalog it. This was the state of the museum in 2016. It has undergone several different curators or keepers that were not interested in the old anatomy collection, and it was finally put away in 1948, and then made very little use in the following years, till during the move of the medical school at their current buildings at Trinity Biomedical Sciences building. The lecture theater that you saw earlier was examined, and a lot of this collection was found under it. So it was all hidden for a long time, till about 2011. And now we have quite a lot of work in our hands. This is a museum now. It is in its original architectural state. But as I said, the contents have changed dramatically over the years. And this is the lecture theater that I showed you before, a different view. And I just want to show you a little taste. We recently had their spaces 3D scanned, and we hope to share those scans with the public later on in the fall. Here are my sources. I don't know how I'm doing on time.
You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. So I owe a lot of gratitude to Dr. Copley for this book, Medicine in Trinity College Dublin, and a few others that are now no longer alive for me to thank. So thank you very much. You can reach us at my email, evi.numen@tcd, or Old Anatomy at TCD, and we're very much looking forward to showing you more of the collection as we uncover it and research it. The exhibition that we're part of, that is opening today, is actually the first more extensive exhibition that we've been part of, and the first time that most of the items in it are seen and shared with the world. So that is very exciting for us, and we're very grateful to the Worth Library and Dr. Boran for making that possible. Thank you.